Everyone needs a little hero. Chapter 1. Rings and Memories. The apartment complex wasn't the newest and had few features that could be identified as the latest and greatest. Sometimes there were problems with the water, and sometimes the lights flickered at odd times of the day and night. Every so often things would go missing or just get misplaced. One thing this apartment complex did have, however, were stories. Each of its dozen floors held people from different places and backgrounds. Some people were thriving, others trying to make their way. Some were going through hardships, and a few just needed a friend, someone to talk to. One other thing this place had among its labyrinth of walls and wires was a whole other world. A smaller world consisting of dozens of families, some of them big, some of them small, but all of them little. These were the borrowers. The 4-inch folk live in quiet solitude, surviving by taking what they need in pieces, parts, fragments, and segments. Rarely did something of significance go missing, and, even then, it wasn't the humans' fault for being so clumsy. There were rules for keeping themselves undiscovered by the humans, and, for the most part, these rules were upheld. There were times where humans spread rumors or asked if there were mice and such in the building. Thankfully, the borrowers had managed to steer clear of the exterminators and their traps. It was one of their biggest fears, to be seen and caught by a human. Hero grew up with 2 older brothers, an older sister, and a younger sister. He also had his parents, grandparents, and even a great-grandfather. His family had never immigrated, a rarity among their kind, and had always been careful. Subtly, the younger borrower with sandy brown hair and bright green eyes had always feared the humans, but also found them fascinating. Humans were dangerous, yes, but were also ingenuitive and forward-thinking. They had creativity and passion, as well as the means to do so. Hero knew they had the ability to do horrendous things, but they also had the power to do good. Every once in a while, he would venture through the walls and listen to the humans watching that big flat thing called a TV, or a screen. They watched scary things, but the thing Hero was fascinated with was the show about villains and, like his name, heroes. These heroes had powers and would fight against injustice, whatever that was, and the bad people hurting other people. Some could shoot lasers while others could fly. Some were strong. Some could use their hair. One thing that Hero noticed about all of these people was that it didn't matter who they were or what they looked like. They were all heroes. Some of them, he noticed, didn't even have powers. There was one boy who was drawn with green hair and cried a lot, that talked about what it meant to be a hero, and somehow the younger borrower found this inspiring. He knew from that moment on he had to live up to his name. Now, how he was going to go about this, he wasn't sure. He had only just had his 13th birthday and was 3.5 or so inches tall on a good day. Needless to say, his height was going to be a slight issue, but it wouldn't stop him. According to some people on a thing called the internet, you didn't need to save lives or stop buildings from falling down to make a difference in someone's life. This is the notion that Hero clung to one night after he debated for the 100th time with himself. He didn't need to be big to make a difference. In fact, some guy by the name of Gamdalf said that it was the ordinary actions of small folk that made a difference. It was settled, and Hero knew who he wanted to help first. On the 3rd floor, there was an elderly couple who loved each other very much. Hero liked going down and listening to them talk. They were hilarious, mostly because they were forgetful from time to time and would move things without telling the other. "Where are my glasses?" asked the woman. "I don't know, dear. Where they were on your head. Did you check there?" the man would respond, all the while wearing them on his head because he thought those were his glasses. Hiro could watch them for hours and be amused. There were a few times, accidentally, where he was laughing so hard that they stopped and looked up at the trim near the ceiling. "Those neighbor kids must think something's pretty funny." A handful of those comments made Hiro well aware he needed to be careful, even when they had a hard time remembering. The final straw in his debate on helping them first, in fact, came from the saddest of events. The elderly man, one night, had fallen and went some place for him to get better called a hospital. But that didn't happen. The woman came back so very sad, and Hiro wanted nothing more than to cheer her up. He had come up with something, and he had to do it quickly, as he began to hear rumors that she was immigrating and could see the boxes being loaded up. It was just after dinner, and his siblings were out borrowing, except for his younger sister, Winnie, who was far too young to go borrowing, being only 6. Hiro stood in his room with all of his necessary supplies laid on his bed. He had a fishing hook, a safety pin, 1 Band-Aid, a pin, battery lamp with a new borrowed bulb, a piece of razor, and a strong line which he had checked a dozen times. There were a few moments where he paused to breathe, staring at his muddled reflection and a piece of tin foil he kept in his room. Heroes usually have some kind of outfit or cape. Do I need a cape? I don't know. Capes get in the way. What about a mask? No, that won't work. It might get in my eyes. This is fine for now. Hiro puffed out his chest, grabbed his backpack of supplies, and headed out through the walls. He made sure to wave to his grandparents as he ran past their hallway. His little legs carried him at a steady pace past the pipes to the wires he had to lay on to cross from one wall joist to the next. The drop was at least a floor, and would certainly be a problem if he were to slip, but the wires were coated with rubber, and were nice and thick. Hiro had also learned the pro tip from his oldest brother, Atlas, of hooking the safety pin from his backpack onto the line. Since it was strapped to him, it added an extra safety measure. Hiro slowed his jog to a brisk walk as everything began setting in for him. Was he ready for something like this? He was only 13 after all. He had been borrowing on his own, but this would be different in that now he was going to purposefully move something for the human to notice and become curious about. Hiro cupped his palms and smacked his face lightly to snap himself out of it. It wasn't like he was going to be seen or anything. Plus, the elderly woman was forgetful. Even if he were seen, she would most likely forget. Right? The labyrinth of walls passed by quicker than he expected. Before the young borrower knew it, he was standing above one of the ceiling fan tiles that they used to observe. He could already hear the daughter and the older lady talking. "Mom, what are you looking for?" asked the daughter. "Well, I'm sure I saw it in here somewhere," the older woman replied. "Dad's ring?" prompted the daughter. "Mom, you looked there already. It's been lost for years." "Pish posh, I remember seeing it just the other day," the mother responded as she continued to rummage through the next box. She started tearing the tape off of another when the daughter intervened. "Here, Mom, why didn't you check this box?" she suggested. But the mother shook her head. "No, I distinctly remember seeing it by the couch. These boxes must be on top of it." Hiro listened for a few more minutes, saddened by the encounter. Now knew what he had to do. He was going to find that ring. He pulled himself from the ceiling tile, ensuring it was secure, before heading for the nearest wall that could take him to the ground, which was not a far walk. The path to and from this apartment was used well, so it had a permanent line anchored to it. The sheer drop down was enough to make his knees weaken and his head spin with vertigo. Heights weren't always an issue, but that little bit of nervousness was something Hiro took as a good sign. If he weren't nervous, he might miss checking something before climbing the line. There was darkness below, where there was usually light. Must be a bad bulb. He wrapped his hands around the line, checking his footing, and descended the line knot after knot. It took some time, but he finally reached the ground by the floorboards. The walls absorbed the light of his hip lamp. Small dust particles drifted around in the air, lingering as the footsteps above knocked them loose. The Christmas lights, which usually illuminated most of the main hallways they traversed, were still hanging on the walls on top of the thumbtacks. Something about the air didn't set right with Hero. There was an eerie stillness under the floorboards of the older woman's apartment. Hero felt himself freezing. There was a nervousness in his chest. His heart was beating so incredibly fast now. When did that happen? The determined boy couldn't let these things bother him now. He puffed out his chest with a deep inhale and stepped further into the darkness. The joists towered above him at a whole 7 inches and effectively had him surrounded on his left and right. Hero began walking up and down the floor joists, starting where he was at the entrance and working his way to the sitting area. Hero knew where the old woman's couch was in the apartment, and he also knew there were several wide floorboards and some holes the other borrowers had left in case they needed to make a hasty exit. Maybe it was unlikely, but Hero suspected that if something had been knocked into the floor, it could have fallen through one of those hiding holes. He passed by a few more unilluminated lights and noticed a few of the wires were exposed, chewed through. Suddenly, his keen ears picked up something. If he hadn't been on edge, he might have missed it. The light on his hip lamp only illuminated a foot or so in every direction, but sound didn't need light to be heard. A skittering sound of clawed feet scraping just on the other side of one of the joists. It stopped. Then it started again. Immediately, his heart leapt into his throat, and the borrower boy stopped dead in his tracks. Hero instinctively pulled his pin from his side and held his hip lamp in his right hand. He peered around the corner and could see with his bright green eyes the small tail of a mouse skittering away from the little bit of light from Hero's lamp. He exhaled shakily. Maybe he wouldn't need to fight it today. He glanced down the passage and decided to follow behind carefully. Cautious step after cautious step, Hero eventually heard the mouse head back down through the walls as he turned down the next corridor. Sadly, there were only 3 left for him to check. As he walked down the next hall feeling discouraged, he realized that there was a slight glint up ahead. Still brandishing the pin, Hero stepped forward with the light extended until he recognized the shape of a circle. A ring. He had found it. The tarnishing silver ring was thick and heavy with writing Hero didn't recognize. Reading was something his parents insisted that he learn, but even that didn't help him with these words. There was also some kind of glittery rock in the middle. Now all that needed to be done was get it to the humans without getting caught. This was going to be interesting. First and foremost, move it. It took some time, but the ring was eventually wrestled into the borrowing bag. The weight was significant and made normal borrowings feel light as a feather. Still, it would not stop the mission. Hero now had to determine where to put it. Both of the humans were still at home, and from the sound of it, things were being moved around. Hero was usually very dexterous and quick, but he was encumbered by the weight. So, going up right then and there was out of the question. While he walked back through the halls, he made his decision. He would wait until nighttime and put it in the woman's bedroom where he knew she could find it, her bedside table. The thought of being so terribly close to a human made his insides flip anxiously. Still, he knew he had to persevere. The trek to the elderly woman's room was a long one, and one that was taken with caution. That mouse was still roaming around, and the last thing that Hero needed was a confrontation when he was debating how to get to the top of the table with a ring in tow. While he walked, he thought of scenario after scenario. I could climb it, obviously, but the weight on my back may make me tired before I reach the top. I could try to pull it up once I climb to the top, but that leaves me on top of the table for a bit longer than I would want. I could try and tie one end to the ring and one end to me and jump, and have it slingshot up to the top. Before he knew it, he was under the floor of the bedroom. Hero let his pack slump off of his shoulders and onto the ground, rubbing and aching the muscles and tendons in his shoulders. Up above, he could hear the sounds of feet shuffling against the ground. She must be getting ready for bed, earlier than normal. The teen waited until the shuffling stopped to make his move, which he finally figured out. He was going to pull the ring up onto the desk. Climbing would be too tiresome, and he weighed more than the ring. Even if his shoulders argued otherwise, climbing would be too tiresome, and he weighed more than the ring. Even if his shoulders argued otherwise, and he could control the descent. The pack was on his shoulders again, and he was on his way. Up through the opening in the baseboard under the bed, Hero tread lightly up to the immense bedside table, extinguishing his light before arriving. His keen ears picked up on the light sound of breathing just above him. Perfect. Completely quiet. He tied the line onto his bag before removing his hook. Pause for a breath. Aim. Swing. Swing. Hero let the hook fly from his hands and heard the hook sink in with a firm knock. Perfect. He shimmied up the rope in no time, glancing over to see the sleeping woman barely 2 feet from him. A shiver ran down his spine. It was completely involuntary, and it was only then that Hero realized this was the closest he had ever been to a human before. Everything about them was so much bigger than him. Their faces, those eyes. It made his head and insides flip and swirl at the very notion of their hands. Don't think about that now. You need to get the ring back on the table. He began pulling his bag up the line. It tapped the table a few times on its ascent, which made him freeze and watch. Not a single stir. It wasn't until Hero had pulled up the bag and began pulling out the ring that he heard the older woman stir, shifting under the sheets that could easily smother him. His heart rate spiked, forcing him to swallow dryly as he finished pulling the ring free from the satchel. The ring was right there in view next to the clock and the lamp. It wouldn't be hard to find. Hero had almost reached his line when he heard something. What is... The voice of the elderly woman, still saturated with a groggy tiredness. Hero's breath hitched in his throat, every impulse shrieked. He almost threw himself off of the table when he saw a hand beginning to emerge from beneath the quilts and covers. Instead, he threw his bag over one shoulder and grabbed the line. The rope burned his fingers and palms, and he landed on the ground with a definite thud just as the light came on. There was no time. He backpedaled as fast as he could from the line, regretting using his best hook. He was halfway to the hidden entrance when he heard her speak again. "Oh, my Stuart's ring." Hero stopped in his tracks. Stuart? Was that his name? The older man? "Oh, thank you, little sprite." Hero's breath stopped completely. Was she able to see anything? Would she look? All he knew was he heard the clattering of his hook to the ground, a sniffly sob, and then the lights turned out again. It was a risk, but Hero needed his hook. He quickly darted back and retrieved the hook. However, just before he left, he uttered the smallest, "You're welcome," before darting back into the cover of the walls. Mission success. Maybe he was seen. Maybe the old woman believed in such things. He didn't know. What was certain was he had made someone's day a little better, and that's all that really mattered to him.